Welcome to the heart of Los Angeles, 1940. The city hums with the sounds of a growing metropolis. But in the alleys, backrooms, and smoke-filled clubs, a darker story unfolds. The kind of story that doesn't make the headlines, the kind that lingers in the whispers of those who know what's truly happening behind closed doors. It's here, in the gritty, sun-baked streets of California, that Jack Dragna made his mark. A man of few words, but even fewer scruples. He wasn't one to charm his way to the top, and he didn't need to. Jack Dragna demanded respect, and if you didn't give it, he made sure you knew who was in charge. As the City of Angels looked toward its future, the criminal world was far more concerned with the present. Today's score, today's protection money, and who controlled what part of this sprawling urban jungle. In the midst of all this, Jack Dragna stood tall, a man whose name echoed not just in LA, but across the nation. He was the boss of the Los Angeles crime family, and when he spoke, people listened. He didn't operate like the smooth-talking New Yorkers, the flashy Italians from back east. Jack wasn't a man of glamour. He was a man of action. In those days, power in the world of organized crime wasn't about being the loudest in the room. It was about knowing when to make your move, when to step back, and how to make deals that others would only dream of pulling off. Jack Dragna had learned early on that in a world filled with bloodshed, betrayal, and broken promises, the only thing that could be counted on was your word. And if you didn't keep that, you wouldn't last long. The rain hadn't stopped for days, and tonight it came down in sheets, drenching the streets of downtown LA. The neon signs flickered on and off, casting eerie reflections on the wet pavement. It was the kind of night that made you feel like anything could happen, like the world could flip on its head with the wrong move. A man who wasn't in control could disappear. But Jack Dragna? He was never caught unaware. The story starts not with a grand heist or a dramatic showdown, but with something far more subtle, the kind of thing that happens behind the scenes, in places most people would never notice. It's 1942, and Jack Dragna sits in his office, the faint hum of city life filtering through the windows of his darkened headquarters. The walls are adorned with old photos, framed newspaper clippings of his rise through the criminal ranks. His face expressionless in every picture. There's a steady rhythm to his life, one that Jack had honed over the years. Meetings, negotiations, and, more often than not, making sure everyone in his network knew their place. Los Angeles was a city of dreams for most, but for Jack Dragna, it was a city of opportunity, a city to be carved up and owned. Tonight, he's waiting on a deal, a big one, the kind of deal that could cement his legacy in the criminal world. It involves a shipment, one that's worth millions, a shipment of goods that could make Dragna's hold over LA even tighter. The shipment's owner is a shady figure, a man named Jimmy, the Greek, who's known for being difficult, untrustworthy, and full of surprises. But Jimmy's not the real problem. It's the fact that there are other players involved. Gangsters from other parts of the country who've set their eyes on LA. Dragna knows it, and he's been preparing for this moment for months. The clock ticks by, slow and deliberate. Dragna doesn't rush. It's a key part of his strategy. He's always been the kind of man who takes his time, making sure every detail is in place before he moves. And so, as the city sleeps, Jack Dragna waits. He's not alone, though. Sitting across from him, his consigliere, a man named Salvatore Big Sal Moretti, stares into the distance, his broad shoulders hunched over in quiet contemplation. The two men have been through a lot together, seen the city transform in ways they never could have imagined. They've seen rivals rise and fall, and Jack Dragna had made sure he'd always come out on top. But tonight was different. There was something in the air, the kind of tension that only comes before a storm. Just then, the door opens and a figure steps in. It's one of Jack's men, a trusted soldier by the name of Vito. His face is set in that familiar grim expression, the kind that only comes when something's gone wrong. "Boss, it's Jimmy," Vito says, his voice low. "He's late, and I've got word from the street. There's talk, people are asking questions. Something's not right." Jack Dragna doesn't flinch. He takes a slow drag from his cigarette, the glow lighting up his sharp features. "People ask questions every day, Vito. That's how rumors get started." "What else?" Vito hesitates, but only for a second. There's also talk of some other crew from the East Coast. They've been asking about our territory. Jack's eyes narrow. He leans back in his chair, steepling his fingers. This is the moment. This is the kind of situation that could make or break a man. If Dragna doesn't respond the right way, if he doesn't keep his cool, he could lose everything. The power, the respect, the life he's built in this city, all of it could slip away. He stands up slowly, his movements deliberate. Get me a car. We're going to pay Jimmy a visit. As the night deepens, the city's glow becomes a blur of neon lights and shadows. Jack Dragna isn't just stepping out into the rain. He's stepping into a world where everything is in motion. Deals are made, alliances are tested, and the stakes are always life and death. There's no room for mistakes here. This city belongs to those who can hold their ground, to those who don't flinch when the pressure's on. And Jack Dragna? He wasn't about to let anyone take what was his. The car rolls through the slick streets, the rain beating down on the roof. It's a quiet ride, but Jack's mind races, sorting through the pieces of the puzzle. He's been around long enough to know that nothing, in the world of organized crime, is ever as simple as it seems. There's always a twist, always a catch. And if he doesn't handle this right, if he doesn't make the right moves tonight, the balance of power in Los Angeles could shift forever. He looks out the window, watching the city pass by, thinking about how far he's come, and about how much further he's willing to go to hold on to it all. And deep down, Jack knows this. In this game, trust is the most fragile thing of all. When you're at the top, everyone wants to bring you down. The trick is knowing who to trust, and when to make your move. The rain taps against the window like a countdown. Jack Dragna knows that once he steps into that meeting, everything changes. The car pulls up to a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of downtown Los Angeles. It's not much to look at, just a faded sign above the door reading Jimmy's Club in worn letters. But Jack Dragna knows what's behind those doors isn't about neon lights or flashy signs. This is where deals are made, where the real power lies, behind the scenes, in the hands of men like him, men who built empires without ever drawing attention to themselves. Jack steps out of the car, his polished shoes clicking against the wet pavement. Big Sal follows closely behind, his hulking figure cutting a shadow in the dim glow of the streetlight. The rain continues to pour down, the world around them seeming to close in, like the city itself is holding its breath. As they approach the entrance, two men step forward from the shadows. More of Jack's soldiers, their faces unreadable. They nod silently as Jack passes, their eyes scanning the street, ever vigilant. It's a reminder that, even in the quiet moments, danger is never far behind. Inside the club, the atmosphere is thick with smoke and the low murmur of conversation. A jukebox in the corner plays an old Sinatra tune, its melancholy notes rising and falling, barely audible over the clinking of glasses and the shuffle of feet on the floor. But Jack doesn't come for the music or the drinks. He's here for something else. He walks through the room like he owns it because, in many ways, he does. The patrons fall silent as he moves, their eyes following him, some with fear, some with respect. Jack doesn't acknowledge them. He's not interested in their attention. He's here for one man, and one man only. Jimmy the Greek is sitting at the far end of the room, a well-dressed man with a slicked-back mane of dark hair and a constant air of agitation about him. He's surrounded by a few of his own men, each of them watching the door, alert, just like Jack's crew. But Jimmy knows who's coming. He knows Jack Dragna doesn't make unannounced visits. When Jack reaches the table, he doesn't sit down. He stands there for a moment, studying Jimmy, his face a mask of indifference. Jimmy stands too, a little too quickly, almost nervously. Jack. Jimmy greets him with a forced smile. I wasn't expecting you tonight. What's the occasion? Jack doesn't smile back. His eyes are cold, calculating. You know why I'm here, Jimmy? The shipment. It's overdue. I don't like waiting. Jimmy's smile falters for just a split second, but he recovers quickly. It's not like that, Jack. I got your goods. They're just what? Jack interrupts, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. You think I don't know when someone's playing me, Jimmy? You think I don't know about the crew from New York sniffing around my territory? Jimmy's eyes widen, and for the first time, his usual confidence begins to crack. I didn't tell anyone. Doesn't matter. Jack cuts him off again. I've got ears everywhere. I know what you've been doing. And if you think for 1 second that you can play me for a fool, I'll remind you how fast this city can turn on you. The room grows heavier, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jimmy looks around nervously, his men starting to shift, uncomfortably in their seats. But it's clear this is Jack's show now. Let's sit down, Jack says, his voice suddenly calm again, like nothing had happened. He gestures to the empty chairs at the table. I didn't come here to make a scene. I came here for one thing, to get what's mine. Jimmy hesitates, but after a moment, he motions for his men to step aside. They sit, Jack taking the chair across from him, Big Sal remaining standing behind him. Jimmy seems unsettled, his usual bravado replaced with the unmistakable signs of a man on edge. All right, Jimmy says, his voice shaky. The shipment's been delayed. There were complications, but... Complications? Jack's eyes narrow. You think I give a damn about complications? This is business, Jimmy. And business doesn't wait for anyone. Not even you. Jimmy swallows hard, and for a moment he looks like he might say something else. But instead he nods. All right. The goods are coming in. I'll make sure they're here by the end of the week. Jack leans forward, his gaze never leaving Jimmy's face. By the end of the week. And you better hope you're telling me the truth, because if I find out otherwise, this little delay is going to be the least of your worries. The air between them is thick with unspoken words. Jimmy can sense the finality in Jack's tone, the edge of danger that accompanies every word he says. This is a man who's not afraid to follow through on his threats, and Jimmy knows it. I'll have it, Jimmy says, his voice barely a whisper now. You'll have it. Jack doesn't respond right away. He just sits there, staring at the man across from him, weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, Jack stands up, straightening his coat. He looks down at Jimmy, who is still seated, his hands trembling slightly on the table. Good, Jack says. I'll be back in a few days. Make sure you keep your word. Because if you don't... He lets the sentence trail off, knowing Jimmy understands exactly what he means. With that, he turns and walks away, Big Sal following close behind. As Jack steps back into the rain-soaked streets of LA, he feels the familiar sense of power settle back into his bones. This is his city, and no one is going to take it from him. Not Jimmy, not the East Coast crews, not anyone. The rain is still coming down, but Jack doesn't care. The world outside is chaos, but inside his mind, everything is under control. For now, at least, the next few days pass in a haze of uncertainty. The city of Los Angeles, as vibrant as it seems during the daylight hours, holds a different kind of pulse in the darkness. When the sun sets, the shadows grow long, and the streets begin to hum with the sound of cars on wet pavement and low murmurs in alleyways. It's during these hours that men like Jack Dragna thrive. Behind closed doors, in the dim glow of lamps, and in the quiet moments before everything boils over. Jack's mind never stops working. Even when he's not meeting with Jimmy or handling business, he's thinking, calculating. There's a lot at stake right now, more than just the shipment. The air is thick with tension, and Jack can feel it. The East Coast crews, the ones trying to muscle in on his territory, they're a threat. But it's more than that. He knows that people like Jimmy, who deal in lies and half-truths, will always find a way to try and take advantage if you let your guard down. And Jack Dragna doesn't let his guard down. His crew remains loyal, as always. Big Sal, Vito, and the others, they understand the game. They know that when Jack speaks, it's not just the words, it's the weight behind them. That's how Jack has always moved through the world. Silent, focused, with an air of authority that leaves no room for doubt. But lately, there's been a shift. Jack can sense it in the air, in the way people talk, the way his men look at him with that familiar glint in their eyes, like they're waiting for something, unsure of what's coming next. Even Sal, his right-hand man, who's usually the picture of calm, has started to act a little restless. Maybe it's the pressure. Maybe it's the uncertainty of what's ahead. Or maybe it's just the nature of the world they live in. One wrong move and it all comes crashing down. On the fourth day after his meeting with Jimmy, Jack finds himself standing on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city. The lights twinkle in the distance, a sea of brightness stretching out beneath him. For a moment, he allows himself to relax, to just breathe in the cool night air. But that moment is fleeting. He knows that peace in this line of work is temporary, and the quiet never lasts long. A knock at the door pulls him back from his thoughts. "Boss!" Vito's voice calls through the door. "We've got a problem." Jack's pulse doesn't race. His heartbeat remains steady, his mind already shifting gears. Problems are a part of life when you're at the top, and Jack has learned how to handle them with a level of detachment that borders on clinical. "Come in," he calls out, his voice calm, steady. Vito enters, a concerned look on his face. "It's Jimmy." He's lying. "The shipment, it's not coming in. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. And we've heard word, his crew's making moves in the city. They're stirring up trouble." Jack doesn't show any sign of surprise, but inside he's already working the angles. "How sure are you of this?" "We've got eyes on him, boss. He's been meeting with the East Coast crews in secret. And word on the street is that Jimmy's been talking about cutting a deal with them. A bigger cut, a new distribution network. That's not part of our deal." Jack stands up slowly, his gaze hardening as he processes the information. Jimmy's playing both sides. He's thinking about betraying me, and now he's trying to bring in outsiders. His voice is quiet, but there's a lethal edge to it. "He's testing my patience. Should we act on it?" Vito asks, his voice full of uncertainty. "We could take him out now before things get worse." Jack shakes his head, a small smirk forming on his lips. "No, Vito. We don't act on impulse. We make sure Jimmy knows who he's messing with first. He won't get away with this. But if he thinks he can play both sides, then we'll let him think he can. We're going to make him regret it." He walks over to his desk, pulling out a thick cigar from the humidor. The lighter flickers, and the smoke curls up into the air. Jack inhales deeply, letting the familiar burn settle in his lungs before exhaling slowly. "I've got an idea. But first, we need to send a message." 3 days later, Jack finds himself back in the streets of Los Angeles. But this time, he's not alone. Big Sal, Vito, and a few other trusted men are with him. The plan is simple. Hit Jimmy's crew where it hurts. Not with violence, not yet at least, but with something far more effective. The kind of pressure that leaves men like Jimmy no choice but to fall in line. They arrive at a small warehouse just outside of town. One of the places Jimmy's been using for storage. The area is desolate, far from the watchful eyes of the public, and that's exactly how Jack likes it. He's already got his men posted at every exit, ensuring no one can escape. There's a sense of quiet anticipation in the air, the kind that precedes something inevitable. Jack stands outside the warehouse, his coat pulled tight against the wind. He's calm, collected, but inside, there's a simmering anger. It's not just about the shipment. It's about respect. It's about keeping what's his. And no one, not Jimmy, not anyone, gets to play in his territory without consequences. As he walks inside, his steps measured and purposeful, the crew follows closely behind. The men inside the warehouse freeze when they see him, their hands hovering over their weapons, but no one dares to make a move. They know Jack's reputation, and they know what happens when you test that reputation. Jimmy is standing by the back of the room, looking uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Jack and the men who've come with him. His crew is silent, unsure of how to react. "Jack," Jimmy says, his voice tight with nervousness. "What's this all about?" Jack looks at him, his gaze unwavering. This is a reminder, Jimmy. A reminder that you don't get to make deals behind my back. You don't get to sell out to the highest bidder and think there won't be consequences." Jimmy tries to keep his cool, but the sweat on his forehead betrays him. "I didn't." "Shut up," Jack snaps, his voice low but full of authority. "I don't care about your excuses. What I care about is you crossing me. And trust me, Jimmy, that's something you'll regret." He gestures to Big Sal, who steps forward with a small stack of papers. "These are your books, Jimmy. Your operations. The ones you've been running behind my back. We're taking control of them, and we're taking control of the city." The room is still, deathly quiet. As Jimmy looks down at the papers, his face pale. He opens his mouth to say something, but Jack cuts him off. "No more lies, no more games. This is how it's going to go from now on. You'll answer to me. You'll do business my way. And if you think you can outsmart me..." Jack lets the threat hang in the air like smoke, the tension palpable. Jimmy knows what it means. He knows what happens to men who don't know their place. Jack turns to leave, his men following him out, leaving Jimmy and his crew to stew in the realization that the balance of power in Los Angeles has shifted. As the car pulls away, Jack looks out the window, his mind already working. He's dealt with one problem, but there's still much more to come. The East Coast crews won't back down easily. And Jimmy? He's just the first domino to fall. The rain had stopped, but the tension in Los Angeles was palpable. The city's pulse never slowed, but beneath the hustle and bustle, there was something darker stirring. In the weeks that followed the confrontation at the warehouse, Jack Dragna's name became synonymous with power, respect, and fear. The message he had sent to Jimmy had rippled out across the city like a stone thrown into a still pond, and every corner of LA felt the effects. The East Coast crews had gotten the message, but there was no peace, no rest. In Jack's world, there was no such thing as a permanent victory. That night, Jack sat in his penthouse, the lights of the city stretching out beneath him. It was almost peaceful up here, if you ignored the constant hum of the world below. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the horizon. From up here, everything seemed small, manageable. But Jack knew better. Nothing in this world was ever as simple as it seemed from a distance. His mind turned back to Jimmy. The man had promised to deliver the shipment, but Jack wasn't so naive as to believe that one simple encounter would turn him into a loyal ally. Jimmy had been playing the game for too long. He wasn't going to bend so easily, and Jack knew it. People like Jimmy, who had tasted betrayal once, would always be looking for their next move. The only question was whether Jack would let him make it. Big Sal entered the room, his usual stoic expression in place, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes that Jack noticed immediately. "Something wrong, Sal?" Jack asked, his voice calm, almost casual. Sal hesitated, but only for a moment. "We've got a situation, boss. Word from the street. Jimmy's not playing by the rules. He's talking to the East Coast guys again. And there's talk about a big shipment coming in. Something that could shake things up. People are getting nervous." Jack raised an eyebrow but didn't react immediately. He knew there were always rumors swirling in this world, but he'd learned to separate fact from fiction. "What kind of shipment?" Sal shook his head. "No one's sure yet, but it's something big. And it sounds like Jimmy's trying to pull in more muscle. He's trying to set up his own little empire within LA. Could be more trouble than we expected." Jack sat in silence for a moment, contemplating. "So, Jimmy's decided to test the waters again. Fine. Let's see how he likes it when he realizes the waters aren't as calm as he thinks." He stood up, walking over to the bar and pouring himself a drink. His movements were deliberate, measured. This was not the time for rash decisions. But the pieces were falling into place, and Jack knew what needed to be done. He could already feel the tension in his gut, the anticipation of what was coming next. Every move he made now would set the tone for the rest of the game. "It's time to pay Jimmy another visit," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "But this time, we're not just going to send a message. We're going to show him exactly who he's dealing with." The following night, Jack's car rolled through the winding streets of LA once again. The city was alive, but its undercurrent had shifted. Men like Jimmy, men who thought they could carve out their own piece of the world, were starting to realize just how small they really were. They could scheme all they wanted, but in the end, the city had a way of pulling things back into line. And Jack Dragna was the hand that guided it. As they pulled up to a darkened building near the outskirts of the city, Jack couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. This wasn't just another quiet meeting. Something had changed. Jimmy had made his move, and now Jack was going to counter it. They parked a few blocks away, keeping out of sight. Jack, Big Sal, and Vito made their way through the streets, moving swiftly but quietly. The city was still, almost too still, as if it too were waiting for something to happen. They reached the building, a rundown warehouse on the edge of town. It wasn't much to look at, but the flashing red light above the door told them everything they needed to know. Inside, Jimmy had set up shop with the East Coast crews. This wasn't just a shipment, it was a full-scale operation, and Jack had every intention of taking it apart piece by piece. They slipped inside, the cool air of the night replaced by the heat of the building. Inside, men were moving about in a haze of smoke and whispered conversations. Jimmy's crew was there, along with a handful of unfamiliar faces. The East Coast muscle Jack had been warned about. But no one was prepared for what was coming next. Jack stood in the doorway for a moment, surveying the room. He could see Jimmy across the floor, deep in conversation with one of the East Coast men. They didn't notice him at first. It was only when Jack's men made their move, positioning themselves around the room, that the tension shifted. Jimmy's eyes widened when he saw Jack, and for the first time, there was no bravado, just fear. Jack walked into the room slowly, his shoes clicking against the concrete floor, the sound louder than anything else. His presence was enough to silence the room. Every eye turned toward him. "Gentlemen," Jack said, his voice cutting through the silence. "It seems there's been some confusion." Jimmy opened his mouth to speak, but Jack raised a hand, silencing him. "I'm not here to argue, Jimmy. I'm here to make sure you understand where your place is. And it's not at the head of a new empire. That's my spot, and you've just been reminded of that." He looked around the room at the men from the East Coast. "And as for you guys," Jack's tone shifted, becoming even colder. "You're treading on thin ice. This city isn't big enough for both of us. And if you're not careful, you'll find yourselves on the wrong side of things." The room was dead silent, save for the occasional shuffle of feet. Jimmy's face was pale, his eyes darting between Jack and his crew. He knew the game was up. He knew that every second Jack stood there made it clear who was in charge. "You've been warned, Jimmy," Jack continued, his voice dripping with finality. "Next time, there won't be a warning. I'll take everything you've got." With that, Jack turned to leave, his men following closely behind. As they walked out of the warehouse, Jack's mind was already working, already planning the next steps. This was just the beginning, and there was still much to be done. The East Coast crews wouldn't back down easily, but Jack had always known how to play the long game. The days after the warehouse incident passed in a blur of calculated movements, silence, and tension that crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Jack Dragna's message had been received loud and clear, but even as the dust settled, there was no peace. Jimmy, to no one's surprise, didn't take his beating lying down. Instead, he retreated further into the shadows, trying to lick his wounds while still hoping to play both sides of the game. But Jack wasn't the type to let a man like Jimmy think he could get away with anything. Not in this world. Not in Jack's world. The next few nights found Jack back in the office with Big Sal and Vito at his side. The smoke hung thick in the air, the low hum of city life filtering through the windows. Jack stared out at the sprawling city below, deep in thought. The East Coast crews, the ones who'd been circling like vultures, were still a threat. And Jimmy, he wasn't finished yet. Jack knew that as surely as he knew his own name. But now, it wasn't just about sending messages. It was about control. It was about proving that Jack Dragna wasn't just the boss of Los Angeles, but the man who owned it all. "This is the part of the game where you have to make the right moves," Jack muttered, almost to himself, as he took a long drag from his cigar. Big Sal, standing across the room, adjusted his tie and took a step forward. "What are you thinking, boss?" Jack's gaze was cold as he looked at his consigliere. "I'm thinking we need to act fast. The East Coast crews are making a play. I can feel it. Jimmy's still trying to make deals behind my back, and I'm not going to sit around waiting for him to find his way out of this. Sal nodded. What do you want us to do? Jack exhaled slowly, a plume of smoke rising into the air. I want Jimmy in a position where he has no choice but to bend. I want him to understand that he's not just messing with me, he's messing with everything we've built. We need to hit him hard, but we need to make it count. Vito, who had been standing silently in the corner, stepped forward. We've got word Jimmy's been moving product through the docks. He's making deals under the radar, trying to bring in more of the East Coast muscle. We could hit the docks, take out the shipment, and cripple his operations for good. Jack thought for a moment, weighing the idea. The docks were a strategic target vital for both the shipping business and the underground world of smuggling, gambling, and illegal goods. A strike there would send a clear message to Jimmy and anyone else thinking of crossing him. Make it happen, Jack said, his voice decisive, but we do it with precision. No mistakes. The plan was set into motion almost immediately. Jack's men moved swiftly, quietly, shadowing Jimmy's operation at the docks, keeping a low profile as they gathered information. The city was alive as ever, its pulse continuing to beat as it always did. But underneath it all, a war was brewing. A war for control, for dominance, for survival. The kind of war that people in Jack's world fought every single day. 3 nights later, Jack stood in a darkened alley a few blocks from the docks, his mind focused and calm. Big Sal and Vito flanked him, their presence solid and reassuring. They were waiting for the signal, the moment when the docks would be completely under their control. Jack's plan was simple: hit the shipment, disable the operation, make it clear that there was no room for competition in Los Angeles, not when Jack Dragna ruled the streets. The East Coast crews, no matter how many men they brought, weren't going to be able to stand up to him. Not when Jack was ready to make his move. A low hum of distant engines filled the air as Jack's men quietly spread out around the docks, getting into position. There was a tightness to the moment, a quiet before the storm. Jack had learned long ago that the most dangerous part of any operation was the calm before you made your move. That's when people were at their most vulnerable, when they thought everything was fine. But Jack never underestimated the quiet. He always knew it was the calm before everything changed. As Jack stood there, watching the darkness stretch out before him, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and checked the message. "It's time," the text read. Jack nodded and pocketed the phone. He turned to Big Sal, who was watching him intently. "It's time," Jack said again, this time aloud, his voice calm but carrying a weight that only those who truly knew him could understand. The air was thick with anticipation as Jack and his crew moved in. The docks were a maze of crates and shipping containers, but Jack knew exactly where to look. He had every move mapped out, every detail accounted for. No one would be able to slip away from this. The shipment was his. They moved silently through the docks, cutting off escape routes, surrounding the area with precision. Jack's crew was a well-oiled machine, operating like clockwork. They knew their roles and they knew what was at stake. This was about more than money. This was about control. This was about sending a message. At the heart of the operation, near the farthest dock, a group of men were unloading crates from a cargo ship. They were busy, distracted. Jimmy's men, tough, rough around the edges, but they didn't know what was coming. The East Coast muscle wasn't even aware that Jack was already there. That's the way Jack liked it. Swift, unexpected, like a shadow in the night. Jack signaled to his men. The first shot rang out, a quiet, controlled sound that cut through the stillness of the night. It wasn't a gunshot meant to kill, but to send a clear warning. The men working the docks froze. Jack moved quickly, stepping into view, his cold gaze sweeping over the men. "Everyone stay where you are," Jack's voice echoed in the silence, low but full of authority. "This is my city, and if you don't want it to be the last thing you see, you'll do exactly as I say." The men at the docks looked around, uncertain, but they didn't make a move. They knew better than to cross someone like Jack. They knew that no matter where they were from, no matter who they thought they were aligned with, Jack Dragna was the man who controlled Los Angeles. And no one, not even Jimmy, was going to change that. "Get the crates," Jack ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're taking everything. This shipment belongs to me now." As the crates were loaded onto Jack's trucks, the tension in the air began to dissipate, but the feeling of power lingered. Jack had once again struck, and once again, he had made it clear who was in charge. As the trucks rumbled away, Jack's mind didn't slow. He was already thinking ahead, already preparing for the next move. The East Coast crews might think they could stake a claim in LA, but they were about to learn that this city didn't belong to them. It belonged to Jack Dragna. The night was quiet once again as Jack and his men slipped back into the shadows. And as they disappeared into the Los Angeles streets, Jack knew this. He was still the one who controlled the game, and no one was going to take that from him. The aftermath of the dock raid was as swift and efficient as Jack Dragna himself. By the time the trucks had rolled out of the area, loaded with crates and goods that would fuel his empire for weeks to come, the message was already beginning to take hold. Los Angeles, a city of sun and dreams, had darker undercurrents running through it, and those who sought to undermine Jack Dragna, whether it was Jimmy, the East Coast crews, or anyone else, were quickly learning that there was no place for betrayal in this town. But Jack's mind was always working, always turning. The docks were just the beginning. The city was teeming with potential threats, and Jack knew that for every victory, there was always someone waiting in the wings, ready to take their shot. That's how this game worked. It wasn't about winning just one battle. It was about staying on top long enough to control the whole war. In the days following the raid, Jack kept his movements quiet. He didn't throw a celebration. He didn't gloat. That's not how he operated. No, instead, Jack worked behind the scenes, taking stock of the power shifts and quietly consolidating his hold on the city. The East Coast crews had made their presence known, but now they were licking their wounds. Jimmy, on the other hand, had gone underground. Jack's presence in the docks had been a clear signal that Jimmy's games were over, but that didn't mean the man was out of play. The sun set on another humid Los Angeles evening, and Jack sat in his penthouse, surveying the city below. The lights twinkled, casting reflections in the puddles from the previous rain. For most, it was just another night in LA. But for Jack Dragna, it was the calm before the next storm. Big Sal entered the room without knocking, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. "We've got a situation, boss." Jack didn't look up immediately, his eyes still focused on the city below. He'd been expecting this. "What's happened now?" Sal hesitated for a moment, and Jack's eyes flicked to him. There was something in Sal's expression, something deeper than just business. "Jimmy, he's got help. Word is, he's reached out to some of the higher-ups in the East Coast Mafia. He's asking for backup. He wants to bring in reinforcements." Jack's expression didn't change, but his mind shifted gears. This wasn't just about Jimmy anymore. It wasn't just about an insignificant rat trying to carve out his own slice of the pie. This was a power play, and Jimmy had crossed a line. "Who is he talking to?" Jack asked, his voice quiet, yet laden with authority. "A few names I've heard," Sal said, pulling out a folder and sliding it across the desk. "Guys who've got power in New York, heavy hitters. But we don't have all the details yet. There's still a lot of uncertainty. What we do know is that Jimmy's making deals in the shadows, and he's getting desperate." Jack flipped open the folder, scanning through the information. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze hardening. Jimmy wasn't the type to go down quietly, and if he was reaching out to the East Coast Mafia, it meant he wasn't done yet. The war was far from over. Jack knew what needed to be done. He couldn't let Jimmy regroup. Not now. Not when he had the East Coast crews potentially backing him up. This wasn't just about sending a message anymore. This was about removing a threat completely. "Set up a meeting with the right people," Jack said, his tone final. "I want to know who's involved in this, and I want to make sure Jimmy knows what happens when he tries to bring in outside muscle." Sal nodded. "I'll get it arranged." "Good. And make sure the message is clear. We don't just control Los Angeles, we own it. Jimmy's forgotten that. It's time to remind him." The next night, Jack found himself again on the streets of LA. But this time, the mission was different. It wasn't about raids or shipments, it was about dominance. And when it came to power, there was no room for mistakes. Jack didn't need to tell Sal or Vito what the stakes were. They knew. This was going to be a game-changing move. Jack and his crew arrived at a rundown, industrial building near the heart of the city. The place was off the beaten path, hidden in plain sight. It was a familiar spot, a place where deals had been struck in the shadows for years. The kind of place where people like Jimmy thought they could operate without consequences. Inside, the room was dimly lit, and the air smelled of stale smoke and cheap whiskey. Jack stood at the entrance, taking in the scene before him. The room was full of familiar faces, members of the East Coast Mafia, the ones Jimmy had been in contact with. They were here to make deals, and Jack was here to make sure those deals never saw the light of day. Vito stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. Big Sal was close behind him, his hands resting casually on the grips of his guns. Jack took a moment to soak it all in, letting the tension build before making his move. He knew the game by now, no surprises, just careful, calculated steps. Jack raised his voice, cutting through the murmur of conversations. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone calm but carrying the weight of authority. "I hear there's some talk about making deals with my territory, about stepping into my business. And I'm here to make it clear, that's not going to happen." The room went silent. Jack's presence filled the space like a heavy fog. Every man in the room knew who he was, knew what he was capable of. They had all heard the stories, felt the tension. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a declaration. "You've got two choices," Jack continued. "You can walk out of here, pretend this never happened, and keep your lives. Or we can finish this right here, right now. It's your call." A few men shifted uncomfortably, but the room remained still. Jack could see the fear in their eyes. The East Coast Mafia might have power in New York, but here in Los Angeles, Jack Dragna was the only name that mattered. No one spoke. The silence lingered, thick and oppressive, until finally, one of the men, an older, weathered figure, stepped forward. He was the one who had been behind the deal with Jimmy, the one pulling the strings. Jack knew this moment would define everything. "You don't scare us, Dragna," the man said, his voice low but defiant. "You may control this city, but there's a lot of power in the East. You can't just sweep us under the rug." Jack's eyes flicked to Sal and Vito, his gaze unwavering. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he smiled. "You're right," Jack said, his voice dripping with calm menace. "There's power in the East. But what you don't understand is that I'm not just in control of this city. I'm in control of everything that happens here. And you," he pointed to the man, "you're going to regret ever thinking otherwise." The room fell into chaos in an instant. Jack's men moved swiftly, securing the exits, making sure there were no chances for escape. In the end, it wasn't a fight, it was a surrender. A quiet, certain end to the ambition of men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. Jack walked out of the building, his head held high. The night was still young, but the city had already shifted. The East Coast men had learned the same lesson Jimmy had. Los Angeles didn't belong to anyone else. It belonged to Jack Dragna. The dust had settled, but the aftermath of that meeting still lingered in the air like the scent of smoke after a fire. The East Coast Mafia had learned their lesson the hard way. For them, this was a wake-up call. A reminder that no one could just waltz into Jack Dragna's city and expect to run the show. Jimmy had been trying to play both sides, but now the game was changing, and there was no room for his type of foolishness anymore. Back in his penthouse, Jack sat in the same chair he always did, staring out at the sprawling city below. Los Angeles was a different place tonight, quieter, more subdued. But that was the thing about power. It was always shifting. Even when you were at the top, you had to keep your eyes open. Always. Jack knew that better than anyone. The moment you let your guard down, that was when someone else would come along and try to take it all away. Big Sal and Vito were seated across from him, both men silent, their eyes focused on Jack as he leaned back in his chair, contemplating the events of the last few days. The East Coast crews were licking their wounds, but there were always more players in the game. Men who saw opportunities in the chaos, waiting for a chance to make their move. Jimmy's gone quiet, Vito finally said, breaking the silence. I'd say he's learned his lesson, but we both know that's not likely. Jack didn't reply immediately. He just sat there, his eyes narrowed, watching the city. The silence between them stretched for a long moment. The city seemed to echo with the hum of distant cars and the occasional siren. Jack had been around long enough to know that silence didn't always mean peace. We've handled Jimmy for now, Jack said finally, his voice steady, but with a cold edge. But there's more at play here than just him. The East Coast will keep trying to push into our territory. They'll regroup, and when they do, they'll be more dangerous. Sal looked at Vito and then back at Jack. You want to make another move? Hit them harder. Jack shook his head, his jaw tightening. No. We're not going to chase them around, but we're going to send a message, one that's more permanent than anything we've done before. The East Coast needs to understand that this isn't a place they can just take over. This is my city, and they're guests here. And guests don't get to tell the host what to do. He stood up slowly, his mind already working through the next steps. The strategy was clear in his head. It wasn't about starting another fight, but about making sure that when it came to LA, everyone knew Jack Dragna's name would always be the first one spoken. I've been thinking about something, Jack continued, his voice quieter now, as though speaking to himself more than to his men. We need to cement our place, make it so no one questions where the power lies in this city. I'm not just talking about controlling territory. I'm talking about control on every level. Vito leaned forward, intrigued. You're talking about more than just the streets. Exactly, Jack said, turning to look at him. We've already got the businesses, the rackets, but we need to take control of the city's arteries. The docks, the nightclubs, the unions, everything that keeps this place running. The East Coast can keep throwing punches, but they won't get anywhere if they don't have the pulse of the city. And right now, we've got that pulse in the palm of our hand. Sal gave a low whistle, clearly impressed. So, you're thinking bigger. Jack gave a nod, his eyes cold and focused. Much bigger. We take everything. The cops, the politicians, the unions. We make sure every inch of this city answers to us. And anyone who tries to step out of line doesn't get a second chance. The East Coast crews? They won't be able to touch us if we control the city from the inside out. The idea hung in the air for a moment, a heavy, thrilling weight. Jack's vision wasn't just about muscle and intimidation anymore. It was about taking over the very institutions that made the city tick, seizing control of the things that kept everything moving. The underworld and the real world weren't separate. They were intertwined. And Jack was going to be the one to pull the strings. Sal looked at Vito, then back at Jack. We've got the manpower for it, but this won't be easy. It'll take time. You're talking about a full takeover. I don't expect it to happen overnight, Jack replied, but it's the only way we'll make sure the city stays ours. It's time to put the final piece of the puzzle into place. The next few weeks were a blur of strategic meetings and calculated moves. Jack worked behind the scenes, tightening his grip on Los Angeles, quietly expanding his influence. He met with key players, union leaders, local politicians, influential businessmen, and made sure they understood where their loyalties had to lie. The East Coast crews were still licking their wounds, but Jack knew it was only a matter of time before they would make their next move. And when they did, they wouldn't be ready for the storm he was preparing. The real work began at the docks, the lifeblood of LA. It wasn't just about controlling shipments of goods. It was about controlling the flow of everything that passed through the city. Jack had his men working in every warehouse, every pier, ensuring that his interests were at the forefront. They didn't just handle the goods, they handled the people who handled the goods. In the game Jack was playing, everyone had a price, and he was the one setting the terms. But it wasn't just the docks. Jack turned his attention to the nightclubs and casinos, the places where money flowed freely, and where deals were made behind closed doors. He knew that by taking control of these spots, he could keep the city's elite in his pocket, ensuring that every transaction was filtered through his hands. One evening, as Jack sat in his office, overlooking the city, he was interrupted by a knock on the door. Big Sal stepped in, a look of urgency in his eyes. "We've got a situation," Sal said, his voice tense. Jack's expression didn't change, but his mind immediately started working through the possibilities. "What's happened?" "It's Jimmy," Sal replied. "He's made his move. He's with the East Coast now, and they're not backing down. They're trying to make a push. Rumor is they've got muscle from back east. They're bringing it into the city, and they're coming for us." Jack's eyes darkened. "It's time," he said softly, more to himself than to Sal. "We've given them enough chances. Now we take control once and for all." He stood up, his face a mask of cold resolve. "Get the crew ready. We finish this." The storm that Jack had known was coming had finally arrived. The East Coast, and now Jimmy with them, were pushing hard into Los Angeles, Jack's city, his territory, his empire, and now they were testing him like never before. But Jack had made his mark as a leader through more than just brute force. He'd done it with patience, precision, and an understanding of the game few others could match. Still, the air in Jack's penthouse was thick with tension as he stood, his eyes steely and focused. The game had escalated, and there was no turning back now. The East Coast thought they could come into his city and take what was his. Jimmy had thought he could outsmart Jack. But Jack had learned long ago that power wasn't just about playing the game. It was about being the one who set the rules and making sure everyone else had to follow them. Jack's phone buzzed on his desk, the screen lighting up with a message. He didn't need to check it. He already knew what it was. The East Coast was making their move. Jimmy was making his. And this time, Jack wasn't going to wait for them to make the first strike. "Sal," Jack said quietly, never looking away from the cityscape before him, "get the boys ready. I want every street corner watched, every exit covered. We move in tonight." Sal nodded, his face tight with the weight of what was coming. "Understood, boss. We've got your back." Vito stepped forward, his voice low. "What about Jimmy? Should we deal with him first? Take him out of the equation?" Jack turned, his eyes cold. "We deal with him last. We make sure the East Coast feels the heat first. And when they're bleeding, we'll remind Jimmy who put him in this position." The night was quiet at first. The streets of Los Angeles were still, as they often were, with only the occasional car passing by. The city felt peaceful, but beneath that peaceful exterior, there was something dangerous lurking. Jack Dragna was about to show the world why he was the one in control. As his men moved into position, Jack sat at his desk, his hands steepled together as he thought through every possible scenario. The East Coast crews had brought in reinforcements, but they still didn't know the lay of the land like Jack did. They didn't know the power of his network, the loyalty of his men, or the fact that every move he made was planned and executed with ruthless precision. Jack's grip on Los Angeles had been built on decades of careful maneuvering, controlling everything from the docks to the nightclubs, from the unions to the underground gambling rings. He wasn't just a boss. He was a king, and tonight, the East Coast was about to learn what it meant to challenge the throne. The first move came at the docks. Jack's men had planted the seed of fear with Jimmy's crew weeks ago, and now, that fear was about to blossom into something far more dangerous for the East Coast. Under the cover of darkness, Jack's men swept in, hitting the shipping yards hard. The shipment wasn't just about the cargo, it was about control. And in this game, when you controlled the shipment, you controlled the flow of power. In minutes, the docks were secured, the goods seized, and the East Coast muscle that had been waiting to take their share of the profits was left scrambling. It wasn't just a simple robbery, it was a statement. The East Coast didn't run LA. Jack did. But the docks were just the beginning. Jack had more planned for the night. As the trucks rolled away, Jack turned his attention to the next target, Jimmy. The East Coast crew might have been trying to push into Jack's city, but Jimmy was the one who had started this mess, and he was the one who needed to be taken down first. Jack and his crew arrived at Jimmy's hideout, a quiet, unassuming place on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it was well guarded. Jimmy, after all, had learned the hard way that you couldn't operate in LA without protection. But that wouldn't save him. Jack's men moved like ghosts, quiet and efficient. They took down Jimmy's guards one by one, making sure not to alert anyone to their presence. Jack walked through the front door of the hideout, his expression cold, his steps deliberate. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here to send a message. Jimmy stood by the window, looking out over the city, the glow of the streetlights casting a sickly light on his face. When he turned and saw Jack, his expression went from defiant to fearful in an instant. "I didn't think you'd come for me," Jimmy said, his voice shaky. I thought we could work something out." "You've already made your choice," Jack replied, his tone low, but full of finality. "You don't get to play both sides anymore. You made your bed, and now you're going to lie in it." Jack's men moved in behind him, securing the building. They didn't need to say anything. They knew what was coming next. Jimmy had crossed the line, and there was no coming back from it. The city was Jack's, and anyone who tried to take from him would learn the consequences. "You think you can just take over this city?" Jimmy spat, his voice rising with desperation. "You can't do this, Dragna. The East Coast. The East Coast doesn't control anything here." Jack cut him off, his voice steady. "Not anymore. You're out of moves, Jimmy, and this is where it ends." With that, Jack gave a signal, and his men moved forward swiftly and decisively. Jimmy didn't have a chance to respond. He was done. The East Coast would have no reason to help him now. And in this world, when you lost Jack Dragna's trust, there was no coming back from it. As Jack left the hideout, his crew following behind him, there was a sense of finality in the air. Jimmy's betrayal had been dealt with, but the East Coast was still out there. And now that Jack had sent a message to them, they would either have to accept their defeat or escalate the conflict. Either way, Jack knew what he had to do next. But for now, as he stood outside the building, looking out over the city, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Los Angeles was his. The East Coast had tried to take it, but they had failed. And as for Jimmy, well, Jack had always known that a man like him couldn't be trusted. Jack dragged on his cigar, the smoke swirling around him as he looked down at the lights of the city below. This was just the beginning. There was still more to be done. The game wasn't over yet, but Jack Dragna had proven one thing tonight. When you're the king, you get to write the rules. The early hours of the morning were still dark, but Jack Dragna's mind was already moving faster than the hands of the clock could keep up. The battle against the East Coast was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Jimmy had been taken care of, but the men he'd reached out to from the East Coast weren't going to disappear quietly. There was a storm on the horizon, and Jack knew that it was only a matter of time before it hit. But Jack wasn't afraid of storms. In fact, he welcomed them, because in the end, it was in the chaos that he thrived. The city was still quiet when Jack walked into his office. The lights from the skyscrapers below flickered, but it was the stillness that stood out the most. It was almost as if LA itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was coming next. As he sat down behind his desk, his fingers lightly brushed the glass of whiskey in front of him. He didn't need to drink. It was the moment of quiet reflection that he craved. A moment to remind himself why he did this, why he played this game. The phone on his desk buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. Big Sal's voice came through the line, urgent and steady. "Boss, we've got movement. The East Coast crews are mobilizing. They've got some serious muscle coming in from back east. Word is, they're trying to take over the turf we've been locking down." Jack's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Where?" "They're making a play for the downtown district. They're looking to cut in on the clubs, the casinos, the places where the money's moving. They've got a lot of firepower with them. Might be bigger than anything we've seen yet." Jack paused, letting the information sink in. The downtown district was the heart of the city's nightlife, its gambling, its wealth. If the East Coast crews took control of that area, it would change everything. The money that flowed through those clubs, those casinos, was what kept the wheels of Los Angeles turning. Without it, Jack's influence would be severely weakened. "We can't let them take downtown," Jack said, his voice steady. "We lock it down. I want every one of our men in place. No one gets through. No one." "I'll make the calls," Sal replied. "We've got the manpower, but this won't be easy. They're coming in hard." "I don't care how hard they come," Jack said, his eyes narrowing. "We're not giving an inch. This city is mine, and I'm going to make sure they remember that. By the time the sun began to rise, the streets of LA had transformed. The calm was gone, replaced by the buzzing energy of anticipation. Jack's men were positioned strategically across the downtown district, hidden in plain sight. They weren't just watching the streets, they were controlling them. Jack's plan was simple: force the East Coast crews into a corner, isolate them, and then take them down one by one. He wasn't going to wait for them to make their move. No, Jack was the one in control, and it was time to show the East Coast exactly who ran the show. His men patrolled the streets, mingling with the locals in the clubs, ensuring that any movement would be seen before it could get too far. Jack had always been meticulous in his planning. His network was vast. He had eyes everywhere, ears in every alley, and hands in every deal. The East Coast didn't understand that yet, but they would soon enough. The East Coast muscle arrived in waves, their presence marked by the unmistakable rumble of engines as their cars rolled through the city streets. They were making their move. Jack knew exactly what was coming. They were headed straight for the clubs, straight for the places where the city's money was concentrated. But Jack had anticipated every step they would take. The first group entered one of the more popular clubs downtown, the kind of place that saw thousands of dollars changing hands every night. But when they walked in, they weren't met with the smooth rhythms of jazz or the clink of cocktail glasses. Instead, they were greeted by Jack's men, positioned at every exit, watching from the shadows. The music stopped. The atmosphere shifted. The East Coast men looked around, confused. They hadn't expected this kind of welcome. Not here, not in Jack Dragna's city. One of them, a tall man with a thick accent, stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. "This is our place now, Dragna," he said, his voice full of bravado. Jack's voice rang out from the back of the club, cutting through the tension. "This isn't your place. It's mine. And you're not welcome here." The East Coast men didn't even have time to react. Within seconds, Jack's crew moved into position, surrounding them. The tension in the room was thick, every man in the club standing frozen, waiting to see how this would play out. Jack didn't want bloodshed, not yet. But if these men tried to make a stand, there was no question how things would end. "Turn around and walk out," Jack said, his tone calm but commanding. "This city isn't yours to take. You may have muscle, but I've got control." The tall man sneered, but his hand moved slowly away from his gun. He knew it was over before it had even begun. The East Coast wasn't just trying to take over LA. They were trying to topple Jack Dragna's empire. And they were doing it in the wrong city. Without another word, the East Coast men began to file out of the club, their heads down. They had lost. But Jack knew that this wouldn't be the end of it. The East Coast didn't take kindly to being humiliated. They would regroup. They would try again. But Jack would be ready. Later that night, Jack stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out at the city below. He could feel the weight of what had just happened, the tension, the near conflict, the shifting power. But he wasn't worried. Jack had always known how to weather the storm. In fact, he was counting on it. The East Coast had underestimated him, just as so many had before. But that was their mistake. Jack Dragna wasn't just a gangster. He was the architect of the city's underworld. And when it came to controlling Los Angeles, there was no one who could outplay him. The phone rang again, and Jack picked it up without hesitation. "Sal," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "It's done, boss. We've got the city locked down. They won't be making another move in downtown anytime soon." Jack nodded, satisfied. "Good, but don't get comfortable. This game is far from over." As the night wore on and the city finally began to quiet, Jack knew that the road ahead was going to be a long one. But he was prepared. He always was. The East Coast would try again, and this time, Jack wasn't going to just protect his turf. He was going to make sure the East Coast knew that Los Angeles would never, ever belong to anyone but him. He stood on his balcony for a while longer, the cool night air brushing against his skin, the city stretching endlessly before him. The game was still on, and Jack Dragna was going to win. The days that followed were a mixture of calm and controlled chaos. Los Angeles had always been a city of extremes, but it was becoming clear to Jack Dragna that the game he was playing was no longer just a matter of turf wars or street-level muscle. This was a battle for legacy, for control of everything that Los Angeles represented. The East Coast crews, Jimmy and the rest, had underestimated Jack. They thought they could simply roll in and take what was his. But Jack was no ordinary boss. He was the embodiment of Los Angeles's underworld. He was a king, and he wasn't about to let anyone take his throne. The word spread fast through the streets. Jack had sent a message. The East Coast, once confident in their power, were now reeling, wondering how they had lost so badly. The nightclubs, the casinos, the unions, all of it was Jack's. And anyone who dared challenge him would learn that the consequences were always swift. But Jack wasn't a man who got complacent. He never rested on his laurels. The game never stopped. The second you thought it was over, someone would try to take your crown. In the weeks that followed, Jack shifted his focus. He knew the East Coast was still smarting from their loss, but that wasn't what concerned him. What worried him was the idea of complacency. The idea that he could take his foot off the gas and assume that the city was his without question. He had already learned that no one could be trusted, not even the people closest to him. So he kept his eyes open, his mind sharp, and his grip on the city tighter than ever. One afternoon, as Jack was reviewing reports from his various rackets, always staying one step ahead, Big Sal walked in. There was a different look on Sal's face, something unspoken hanging in the air. Jack didn't look up from his desk immediately, knowing that when Sal had that look, it meant something important. "Talk to me, Sal," Jack said quietly, his voice even, though he could feel the tension already building in his chest. Sal hesitated for a moment, before stepping forward. "It's the East Coast, boss. They're making one last move. Word is, they've got someone close to you. They've been working their way into your operation." Jack's heart skipped a beat. His mind immediately went to the people he trusted most, the ones closest to him. He had spent years building this empire, making sure everything was in place. He had trusted his inner circle, men like Sal and Vito, and others who had been with him since the beginning. But he knew that trust was a luxury in this business, and it was one he couldn't afford. "Who?" Jack asked, his voice sharper now. "I don't know yet," Sal replied. "But we've got a leak, and I don't like the way it smells. There are whispers about a betrayal. Someone who's been feeding the East Coast information. Someone inside." Jack stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. His mind raced. If the East Coast had someone inside his operation, it was worse than he could have imagined. This wasn't just about a few shipments or turf anymore. This was about everything, his empire, his control. If someone could get close enough to feed information to his enemies, it meant his whole structure was vulnerable. "Get the word out," Jack said, his voice cold and controlled. "I want to know who's talking. I don't care if it takes days or weeks. Find the leak and make sure it's plugged." Sal nodded, but before he could leave, Jack added, "And Sal, if you find out who it is, don't hesitate. I don't care what it takes. We protect this family, or we don't protect anything." Sal didn't need to say anything. He understood. Loyalty wasn't something Jack took lightly, and whoever had betrayed him would learn the price of disloyalty in the most painful way possible. For days, Jack's men scoured the city, searching for the traitor within their ranks. The tension was palpable, and Jack felt it deep in his bones. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. If he missed this, it would be the beginning of the end. He had played the game long enough to know how it worked. Loyalty could turn to dust in an instant. He had seen it before, and he would see it again if he wasn't careful. Then, one evening, Sal returned with news. He didn't need to say a word. His face told Jack everything. Sal had found the leak. "It's Vito," Sal said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. Jack froze, the weight of the revelation sinking in like a knife to the chest. Vito, his right-hand man, the one person he trusted more than anyone else. "Vito," Jack repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Sal nodded grimly. He's been feeding information to the East Coast. They've been promising him a bigger piece of the pie, control of the unions, more power in the city. And he's been working with them for months. Jack's fists clenched at his sides, the anger and betrayal surging through him. Vito had been a part of everything, had been with him since the very start. How could he have turned on him? The man who had helped him build this empire. The man who had always been loyal. But loyalty was a fragile thing. One slip and everything could come crashing down. "Where is he?" Jack asked, his voice steady but dangerous. Sal didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just gave Jack a look. He knew what had to be done. Jack didn't waste time. He went straight to Vito's hideout, a place that once felt like a safe refuge, now tainted with the sense of betrayal. As he walked through the door, Vito looked up, a mix of surprise and nervousness on his face. "You," Jack said, his voice cold and unyielding. "You've been playing both sides, feeding them information, betraying me." Vito's face paled, but he didn't deny it. "I never wanted it to go this far, Jack. I thought I could get more. I thought I could have power, too." Jack's gaze darkened, his expression hardening. "You don't get to choose when to turn on me. You were part of this family, Vito. You were one of us." Vito took a step forward, his hands raised in surrender. "Jack, please. I made a mistake. Let me fix it. I can help. Just let me." But Jack cut him off with a wave of his hand. "It's too late for that." There was no room for mercy in Jack's world. Betrayal was unforgivable. He had learned that lesson long ago, and now Vito would learn it the hard way. That night, Jack stood once again on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out at the sprawling city before him. Los Angeles was still his. It always would be. The East Coast had tried to take what was his. Vito had tried to undermine him, but Jack Dragna was still standing. The city's lights twinkled in the distance, as if reminding Jack that no matter how many battles were fought, how many betrayals were uncovered, the game would never end. Jack was the king of this city, and no one was going to take that from him. With one last look at the horizon, Jack turned and walked back inside. The city had a way of testing you, but as long as he was in control, it would never break him. He had built his empire from the ground up, and it would remain his no matter who tried to take it. Jack Dragna had won, and in the end, that was all that mattered.